is Rising, Day 3, Part 2. It was very dark by the time they left. The sky had not cleared, and no moon nor even a single star glimmered through the black night. The lantern that Robin carried on a pole cast a glittering circle of light on the snow, but each of them had a candle in one coat pocket just the same. When they reached the manor, old Miss Graythorne would insist on their coming in and standing in their great stone floor entrance hall with all the lights turned on, each holding up a lighted candle while they sang. The air was freezing, and their breath clouded out thick and white. Now and then a stray snowflake drifted down from the sky, and Will thought of the fat lady in the bus and her predictions. Barbara and Mary were chattering away as cozily as if they were sitting at home, but behind the chatter the footsteps of all the group rang out cold and hard on the snow-caked road. Will was happy, snug in the thought of Christmas and the pleasure of carol singing. He walked along in a contented, dreamy state, clutching the big collecting box they carried in aid of Huntercomb's small, ancient, famous, and rapidly crumbling Saxon church. Then, there ahead of them was Dawson's farm, with a large bunch of many-berried holly nailed above the back door, and the carol singing had begun. On through the village they sang, Noel for the rector, God rest you, merry gentlemen, for jolly Mr. Hutton, the enormous businessman in the new mock Tudor house at the end of the village, who always looked as though he were resting very merry indeed. Once in Royal David City, for Mrs. Pettigrew, the widowed postmistress, who dyed her hair with tea leaves and kept a small limp dog which looked like a skein of grey wool. They sang Adeste Fidelis in Latin and Las Anges dans nos campagnes in French for tiny Miss Bell, the retired village schoolmistress, who had taught every one of them how to read and write, add and subtract, talk and think, before they went on to other schools elsewhere. And little Miss Bell said huskily, Beautiful, beautiful. Put some coins that they knew she could not afford into the collecting box, gave each of them a hug, and Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas, they were off to the next house on the list. There were 4 or 5 more, one of them the home of lugubrious Mrs. Horniman, who did for their mother once a week, and had been born and bred in the East End of London until a bomb had blown her house to bits 30 years before. She had always given them a silver 6pence each, and so she still did, coolly, disregarding changes in the currency. Wouldn't be Christmas without 6pences, Mrs. Horniman said. I laid a good stock in before we got landed with all them decimals, so I did. So I can go on every Christmas just the way I used to. Me ducks, and I reckon my stock will see me out until I'm deep in me grave, and you're singing to someone else at this here door. Merry Christmas. And then it was the manor, the last stop before home. Here we come, a wassailing among the leaves so green. Here we come a wandering, so fair to be seen. They always began with the old wassail song for Miss Graythorne, and this year the bit about the green leaves, Will reflected, was even more inappropriate than usual. The carol bounded its way along, and for the last verse Will and James soared up into the high pealing descant that they did not always use for an ending because it took so much breath. Good master and good mistress, while you're sitting by the fire, pray think of us poor children who are wandering in the mire. Robin tugged the big metal bell pull, whose deep clanging always filled Will with an obscure alarm, and as they spiraled up in the last verse, the great door opened, and there stood Mrs. Graythorne's butler, in the tail coat he wore always on Christmas Eve night. He was not a very grand butler. His name was Bates, a tall, lean, morose man, who could often be seen helping the one-aged gardener in the vegetable garden near the manor's back gate, or discussing his arthritis with Mrs. Pettigrew at the post office. Love and joy come to you, and to you your wassail too. The butler smiled and nodded politely at them, and held the door wide, and Will all but swallowed his last high note, for it was not Bates, it was Merriman. The carol ended, and they all relaxed, shuffling in the snow. Enchanting, Merriman said gravely, surveying them impersonally, and Mrs. Graythorne's high, imperious tones came ringing past him. Bring them in, don't keep them waiting on the doorstep. She sat there, in the long entry hall, in the same high-backed chair that they saw every Christmas Eve. She had not been able to walk for years after an accident when she was a young woman. Her horse had fallen and rolled on her, the village said, but she flatly refused ever to be seen in a wheelchair. Thin-faced and bright-eyed, her gray hair always swept up on top of her head in a kind of knot. She was a figure of total mystery in Huntercombe. "How is your mother?" Mrs. Greythorn demanded of Paul, "and your father?" "Very well, thank you, Mrs. Greythorn. Having a good Christmas?" "Splendid, thanks. I hope you are." Paul, who was sorry for Mrs. Greythorn, always went to some trouble to be warmly polite. He made sure now that his eyes did not flicker round the high-roofed hall as he spoke, for although the cook, housekeeper, and the maid were standing beaming at the back of the hall, and though of course there was the butler who had opened the front door, otherwise in all this great house there was no trace of any visitor, tree, decoration, or any other sign of Christmas festivity, save for one gigantic branch of many-berried holly hanging over the mantel. "An odd season is this," Mrs. Greythorn said, looking at Paul pensively, "so full of a number of things, as that odious little girl in that poem said." She turned suddenly to Will. "And are you having a busy time this year, young man?" "I certainly am," said Will frankly, caught off balance. "A light for your candles," said Merriman in low, respectful tones, coming forward with a box of enormous matches. Hastily they all tugged the candles from their pockets, and he struck a match and moved carefully among them, the light turning his eyebrows into fantastic bristling hedges and the lines from nose to mouth into deep shadowed ravines. Will looked thoughtfully at his tailcoat, which was cut away at the waist, and which he wore with a kind of jabot at the neck instead of a white tie. He was having some difficulty in thinking of Merriman as a butler. Someone at the back of the hall turned out the lights, leaving the long room lit only by the group of flickering flames in their hands. There was the soft tap of a foot. Then they began with the sweet, soft lullaby carol. "Lay, thou little tiny child," ending it with last wordless verse, played only by Paul. The clear, husky sound of the flute fell through the air like bars of light and filled Will with a strange, aching longing, a sense of something waiting far off, that he could not understand. Then, for contrast, they sang "God Rest You Merry Gentlemen," then "The Holly and the Ivy," and then they were back at "Good King Wenceslas," always a grand finale for Mrs. Greythorn, and always making Will sorry for Paul, who had once observed that this carol was so totally unsuited to his kind of music that it must have been written by someone who despised the flute. But it was fun being the page, trying to make his voice so exactly match James's that the two of them together sounded like one boy. "Sire, he lives a good league hence," and Will thought, "We're really doing well this time. I'd swear James wasn't singing it at all if, underneath the mountain, if it weren't for the fact that its mouth's moving, right against the forest fence," and he glanced through the gloom as he sang, and saw with a shock as brutal as if someone had thumped him in the stomach that, in fact, James's mouth was not moving, nor was any other part of James, nor of Robin or Mary or any of the Stantons. They stood there, immobile, all of them, caught out of time, as the walker had stood in Oldway Lane when the girl of the dark enchanted him, and the flames of their candles flickered no longer, but each burned with the same strange, unconsuming pillar of white, luminous air that had risen from Will's burning branch that other day. Paul's fingers no longer moved on his flute. He stood motionless, holding it to his mouth. Yet the music, very much like, but even sweeter than the music of a flute, went on, and so did Will, singing in spite of himself, finishing the verse, "By Saint Agnes' fountain," and just as he began to wander through the strange, sweet, accompanying music that seemed to come out of the air, quite how the next verse could be done, unless a boy soprano were expected to sound like Good King Wenceslas as well as his page. A great, beautiful, deep voice rolled out through the room with the familiar words, a great, deep voice that Will had never heard employed in song before, and yet at once recognized. "Bring me flesh and bring me wine, bring me pine logs hither, though I will see him dine when we bear them thither." Will's head swam a little. The room seemed to grow and then shrink again, but the music went on, and the pillars of light stood still above the candle flames. And as the next verse began, Merriman reached casually out and took his hand, and they walked forward, singing together. "Page and monarch, forth they went together, through the rude wind's wild lament and the bitter weather." They walked down the long entrance hall, away from the motionless Stantons, past Miss Greythorn in her chair, and the cook, housekeeper, and the maid, all unmoving, alive and yet suspended out of life. Will felt as though he were walking in the air, not touching the ground at all. Down the dark hall, no light ahead of them now, but only a glow from behind. Into the dark. "Sire, the night is darker now, when the wind blows stronger. Fails my heart, I know not how. I can no longer." Will heard his voice shake, for the words were the right words for what was in his mind. "Mark my footsteps, good my page, tread thou in them boldly." Merriman sang, and suddenly more was ahead of Will than the dark. There before him rose the great doors, the great carved doors that he had first seen on a snow-mounded Chiltern hillside, and Merriman raised his left arm and pointed at them with his 5 fingers spread wide and straight. Slowly the doors opened, and the elusive, silvery music of the old ones came swelling up briefly to join the accompaniment of the carol, and then was lost again. And he walked forward with Merriman into the light, into a different time and a different Christmas, singing as if he could pour all the music in the world into these present notes, and singing so confidently that the school choir master, who was very strict about raised heads and well-moving jaws, would have fallen mute in astonished pride. The Book of Gare. They were in a bright room again, a room unlike anything Will had ever seen. The ceilings were high, painted with pictures of trees and woods and mountains. The walls were paneled in shiny gold woods and mountains. Paneled in shiny gold wood, lit here and there by strange glowing white globes, and the room was full of music, their own carol taken up by many voices, and in a gathering of people dressed like a brilliant scene from a history book, the women, bare-shouldered, wore long full dresses with elaborately looped and ruffled skirts. The men wore suits not unlike Merriman's, with squared-off tailcoats, long straight trousers, white ruffles or black silk cravats at the neck. Indeed, now that Will came to look again at Merriman, he realized that the clothes he wore had never really been those of a butler at all, but belonged totally to this other century, whichever it might be. A lady in a white dress was sweeping forward to meet them, people round her moving respectfully back to make way, and as the carol ended, she cried, "Beautiful, beautiful, come in, come in." The voice was exactly the voice of Miss Graythorne greeting them at the manor door a little while earlier, and when Will looked up at the face, he saw that, in a sense, this was Miss Graythorne, too. There were the same eyes and rather bony face, the same friendly but imperious manner, only this Miss Graythorne was much younger and prettier, like a flower that has unfolded from the bud, but not yet been battered by the sun and wind and days. "Come, Will," she said, and took his hand, smiling at him, and he went easily to her. It was so clear that she knew him, and that those around her, men and women, young and old, all smiling and gay, knew him too. Most of the bright crowd was leaving the room now, couples in chattering groups in the direction of a delicious cooking smell that clearly signaled supper somewhere else in the house, but a group of a score or so remained. "We were waiting for you," said Miss Graythorne, and drew him towards the back of the room where a fire blazed warm and friendly in an ornate fireplace. She was looking at Merriman, too, including him in the words, "We are all ready. There are no hindrances." You are sure?" Merriman's voice came quick and deep like a hammer stroke, and Will glanced up curiously, but the hawk-nosed face was as secret as ever. "Quite sure," said the lady. Suddenly she knelt down beside Will, her skirt billowing around her like a great white rose. She was at his eye level now, and she held both his hands, gazing at him, and spoke softly and urgently. "It is the third sign, Will, the sign of wood. We call it sometimes the sign of learning. This is the time for remaking the sign. In every century since the beginning, Will, every 100 years the sign of wood must be renewed, for it is the only one of 6 that cannot keep its nature unchanged. Every 100 years we have remade it, in the way that we were first taught. And now this will be the last time, because when your own century comes, you will take it out for all time, for the joining, and there need be no more renewing then." She stood up and said clearly, "We are glad to see you, Will Stanton, sign seeker. Very, very glad." And there was a general rumble of voices, low and high, soft and deep, all approving and agreeing. It was like a wall, Will thought. You could lean against it and feel support. Very strongly he could feel the strength of friendship that came out of this small group of unfamiliar, handsomely dressed people. He wondered whether all of them were old ones. Looking up at Merriman beside him, he grinned in delight, and Merriman smiled down at him with a look of more open, relaxed pleasure than Will had yet seen on the stern, rather grim face. "It is almost time," Miss Graythorne said. "Some small refreshment for the newcomers first, perhaps," a man beside them said, a small man, not much taller than Will. He held out a glass. Will took it, glancing up, and found himself staring into a thin, lively face, almost triangular, thickly lined, yet not old, with a pair of startlingly bright eyes staring at and somehow into him. It was a disturbing face, with much behind it, but the man had swung away from him, presenting Will only with a neat, green velvet-covered back, and was handing a glass to Merriman. "My lord," he said deferentially as he did so, and bowed. Merriman looked at him with a comical twist of the mouth, said nothing, but stared mockingly and waited. Before Will had a chance even to begin puzzling over the greeting, the small man blinked and seemed suddenly to collect his wits. Like a dreamer abruptly woken, he burst out laughing. Ah, no, he said, sputtering. Stop it. I have had the habit for long years, after all. Merriman chuckled affectionately, raised the glass to him, and drank. And since he could make no sense of this odd exchange, Will drank too, and was filled with astonishment by an unrecognizable taste that was less a taste than a blaze of light, a burst of music, something fierce and wonderful sweeping over all his senses at once. What is it? The small man swung round and laughed, his creased face slanting all its lines upwards. Metheglin used to be the nearest name, he said, taking the empty glass. He blew into it and said unexpectedly, An old one's eyes can see, and held it out, and staring into the clear base, Will suddenly felt he could see a group of figures in brown robes, making whatever it was that he had just drunk. He glanced up to see the man in the green coat watching him closely, with a disturbing expression that was like a mixture of envy and satisfaction. The man chuckled and whisked a glass away, and Miss Graythorne was calling for them to come to her. The white globes of light in the room grew dim, and the voices quiet. Somewhere in the house, Will thought he could still hear music, but he was not sure. Miss Graythorne stood by the fire. For a moment she looked down at Will, then up at Merriman. Then she turned away from them and looked at the wall. She stared and stared for a long time. The paneling and the fireplace and the overmantel were all one, all carved from the same golden wood, very plain, with no curves or flourishes, but only a simple petaled rose set in a square here and there. She put up her hand to one of these small rose carvings on the top left-hand corner of the fireplace, and she pressed its center. With a click, and below the rose, at the level of her waist, a square dark hole in the paneling appeared. Will did not see any panel slide away. The hole was simply, suddenly, there, and Miss Graythorne put in her hand and drew out an object shaped like a small circle. It was the image of the two that he had himself, and he found that his hand, as once before, had already moved of its own accord and was clasping them protectively. There was total silence in the room. From outside the doors, Will could certainly hear music now, but could not make out the nature of it. The sign circle was very thin and dark, and one of its inside cross arms broke as he watched. Miss Graythorne held it out to Merriman, and a little more fell away into dust. Will could see now that it was wood, roughened and worn, but with a grain running through. That's 100 years old, he said. Every 100 years, the renewing, she said. Yes. Will said impulsively into the silent room. But wood lasts much longer than that. I've seen some in British museums. Bits of old boats they dug up by the Thames. Prehistoric. Thousands of years old. Quercus Britannicus, Merriman said severely and abruptly, sounding like a cross professor. Oak. The canoes you refer to were made of oak, and further south, the oaken piles on which the present Cathedral of Winchester stands were sunk some 900 years ago, and are tough today as they were then. Oh yes, oak lasts a very long time, Will Stanton, and there will come a day when the root of an oak tree will play a very important part in your young life. But oak is not the wood for the sign. Our wood is one which the dark does not love. Rowan, Will, that's our tree. Mountain ash. There are qualities in rowan, as in no other wood on the earth, that we need. But also there are strains on the sign that rowan cannot survive as oak might, or as iron and bronze do. So the sign must be reborn. He held it up between one long finger and a deeply back-curved thumb. Every 100 years. Will nodded. He said nothing. He found himself very conscious of the people in the room. It was as if they were all concentrating very hard on one thing, and you could hear the concentration. They seemed suddenly multiplied, endless. A vast crowd of stretching out beyond the house and beyond the century or any other. He did not fully understand what happened next. Merriman jerked his hand forward suddenly, broke the wooden sign easily in half, and tossed it in the fire, where a great single log, like their own Yule log, was halfway burned down. The flames leapt. Then Miss Graythorne reached out towards the small man in the green velvet coat, took from him the silver jug from which he had poured the drinks, and threw the contents of the jug on the fire. There was a great hissing and smoking, and the fire was dead. And she leaned forward in her long white dress and put her arm into the smoke and the smoldering ashes, and brought out a part-burned piece of the big log. It was like a large, irregular disk. Holding a lump of wood high so that everyone could see, she began to take blackened pieces from it as though she were peeling an orange. Her fingers moved quickly, and the burned edges fell away, and the skeleton of the wooden piece was left, a clear, smooth circle containing a cross. There was no irregularity to it at all, as though it had never before had any other shape than this, and on Miss Graythorne's white hands there was not even a trace of soot or ash. Will Stanton, she said, turning to him, Here is your third sign. I may not give it to you in this century. Your quest must be all along be fulfilled within your own time. But the wood is the sign of learning, and when you have done with your own particular learning, you will find it, and I can leave in your mind the movements that the finding will take. She looked hard at Will, then reached up and slipped the strange wooden circle into the dark hole in the paneling. With her other hand, she pressed the carved rose in the wall above it, and with the same sight-defeating flash as before, the hole was suddenly no longer there. The wood-paneled wall was smooth and unbroken, as if there had been no change at all. Will stared. Remember how it was done. Remember. She had pressed the first carved rose at the top left-hand corner, but now there were 3 roses in a group at that corner. Which one should it be? As he looked more closely, he saw in fearful astonishment that now the whole wall of paneling was covered in squares of carved wood, each containing a single 4-petaled rose. Had they grown at this moment, beneath his eyes, or had they been there all along, invisible because of a trick of the light? He shook his head in alarm and looked round for Marion, but it was too late. Nobody was close by him. Solemnity had left the air. The lights were bright again, and everybody was cheerfully talking. Merriman was murmuring something to Miss Graythorne, bending almost double to speak close to her ear. Will felt a touch on his arm and swung round. It was a small man in the green coat, beckoning to him. Near the doors, at the other end of the room, the group of musicians who had accompanied the carol began playing again. A gentle sound of recorders and violins, and what he thought was a harpsichord. It was another carol they were playing now, an old one, much older than the century of the room. Will wanted to listen, but the man in the green had hold of his arm and was drawing him insistently towards a side door. Will stood firm, rebellious, and turned towards Merriman. The tall figure jerked upright instantly, swinging around to look for him. But when he saw what was happening, Merriman relaxed, merely raising one hand in assent. Will felt the reassurance put into his mind. Go on. It's all right. I'll follow. The small man picked up a lamp, glanced cautiously about him, then quickly swung the side door open just far enough for Will and himself to slip through. Don't trust me, do you? He said in his sharp, jerky voice. Good. Don't trust anyone unless you have to, boy. Then you'll survive to do what you're here for. I seem to know about people now, mostly, Will said. I mean, somehow I can tell which ones I can trust, usually. But you, he stopped. Well, said the man. Will said, you don't fit. The man shouted with laughter, his eyes disappearing in the creases of his face, then stopped abruptly and held up his lamp. In the circle of wavering light, Will saw what seemed to be a small room, wood-paneled, with no furniture except an armchair, a table, a small step-ladder, and a wall-height glass-fronted bookcase in the center of each wall. He heard a deep, measured ticking and saw, peering through the gloom, that a very large grandfather clock stood in the corner. If the room were dedicated only to reading, as it seemed to be, then it held a timepiece that would give a very loud warning against reading for too long. The small man thrust the lamp into Will's hand. I think there's a light over there, huh? There began an indefinable hissing sound that Will had noticed once or twice in the room next door. Then there was the crack of a match lighting and a loud pop, and a light appeared on the wall, burning at first with a reddish flame, and then expanding into one of the great white glowing globes. Mantles, he said, still very new in private houses, and most fashionable. Miss Graythorne is uncommonly fashionable for this century. Will was not listening. Who are you? My name is Hawken, said the man cheerfully. Nothing more, just Hawken. Well, look here, Hawken, Will said. He was trying to work something out, and it was making him most uneasy. You seem to know what's happening. Tell me something. Here I am brought into the past, a century that's already happened. That's part of the history books. But what happens if I do something to alter it? I might. I could. Any little thing. I'd be making something in history different, just as if I'd really been here. But you were, Hawken said. He touched a spill to the flame of the lamp Will held. Will said helplessly, What? You are, in this century when it happened. If anyone had written a history recording this party here tonight, you and my Lord Merriman would be in it. Described. Unlikely, though. An old one hardly ever lets his name be recorded anywhere. Generally, you people manage to affect history in ways that no man ever knows. He touched the burning spill to a 3-candle holder on the table beside one of the armchairs. The leather back of the chair shone in the yellow light. Will said, But I couldn't. I don't see. Come, Hawken said swiftly. Of course you do not. It is a mystery. The old ones can travel in time as they choose. You are not bound by the laws of the universe as we know them. Aren't you one? Will said. I thought you must be. Hawkins shook his head, smiling. Nay, he said, an ordinary sinful man. He looked down and smoothed his hand over the green sleeve of his coat. But a most privileged one, for like you, I do not belong to this century, Will Stanton. I was brought here only to do a certain thing, and then my Lord Merriman will send me back to my own time. Where? Said Merriman's deep voice to the soft click of the closing door. They do not have such stuff as velvet, which is why he is taking such particular pleasure in that pretty coat. Rather a foppish coat, by the present standard, I must tell you, Hawken. The little man looked up with a quick grin, and Merriman put a hand affectionately on his shoulder. Hawken is a child of the 13th century, Will, he said, 700 years before you were born. He belongs there. By my art he has been brought forward out of it for this one day, and then he will go back again, as few ordinary men have ever done. Will ran one hand distractedly through his hair. He felt as though he were trying to work out a railway timetable. Hawken chuckled softly. I told you, old one. It is a mystery. Merriman, Will said, where do you belong? Merriman's dark, beaked face gazed at him without expression, like some long-carved image. You will understand soon, he said. We have another purpose here than the sign of wood. We three. I belong nowhere and everywhere. Will, I am the first of the old ones. I have been in every age. I exist in Hawken's century. There Hawken is my liege man. I am his lord, and more than his lord, for he has been with me all his life, reared as if he were a son, since I took him when his parents had died. No son ever had better care, Hawken said, rather huskily. He looked at his feet and tugged the jacket straight, and Will realized that for all the lines on his face, Hawken was not much older than his own brother, Stephen. Merriman said, he is my friend who serves me, and I have deep affection for him, and hold him in great trust, so great that I have given him a vital part to play in the quest we must all accomplish in this century, the quest for your learning, Will. Oh, Will said weakly. Hawken grinned at him, then jumped forward and swept him a low bow, deliberately snapping the grave mood. I must thank you for being born, old one, he said, and giving me the chance to scurry like a mouse into another time than my own. Merriman relaxed, smiling. Did you notice, Will, how he loves to light the gas lamps? In his day, they used smoky, foul-smelling candles that are not candles at all, but reeds, dipped in tallow. Gas lamps, Will looked up at the white globe attached to the wall. Is that what they are? Of course, no electricity yet. Well, Will said defensively, I don't even know what year this is, after all. Anno Domino 1875, Merriman said. Not a bad year. In London, Mr. Disraeli is doing his best to buy the Suez Canal. More than half the British merchant ships that will pass through it are sailing ships. Queen Victoria has been on the British throne for 38 years. In America, the president has the splendid name of Ulysses S. Grant, and Nebraska is the newest of the 34 states of the Union. And in a remote manor house in Buckinghamshire, distinguished or notorious in the public eye only for its possession of the world's most valuable small collection of books on necromancy, a lady named Mary Graythorne is holding a Christmas Eve party with carols and music for her friends. Will moved to the nearest bookcase. The books were all bound in leather, mostly brown. There were shining new volumes with spines glittering in gold leaf. There were fat little books so ancient that their leather was worn down to the roughness of thick cloth. He peered at some of the titles. Demontory, Liber, blah, blah, Discovery of Witchcraft, Malleus Maleficarum, and so on through French, German, and another language of which he could not even recognize the alphabet. Merriman waved a dismissive hand at them and at the shelves all around. Worth a small fortune, he said, but not to us. These are the tales of small people, some dreamers and some madmen, tales of witchcraft and the appalling things that men once did to the poor, simple souls they called witches, most of whom were ordinary, harmless human beings. One or two of them truly had dealings with the dark. None of them, of course, had a thing to do with the old ones, for nearly every tale that men tell of magic and witches and such is born out of foolishness and ignorance and sickness of mind, or is a way of explaining things they do not understand. The one thing of which they know nothing, most of them, is what we are about. And that is contained, Will, in just one book in this room. The rest are useful now, and then as a reminder of what the dark can accomplish and the black methods it may sometimes use. But there is one book that is the reason why you have come back to the century. It is the book from which you will learn your place as an old one, and there are no words to describe how precious it is. The book of hidden things, of the real magic. Long ago, when the magic was the only written knowledge, our business was simply called knowing. But there is far too much to know in your day, on all subjects under the sun, so we use a half-forgotten word, as we old ones ourselves are half-forgotten. We call it Gare. He moved across the room towards the clock, beckoning them after him. Will glanced at Hawken and saw this thin, confident face tight with apprehension. They followed Merriman, stood in front of the great old clock in the corner, which was a full 2 feet above even his head, took a key from his pocket and opened the front panel. Will could see the pendulum in there swaying slowly, hypnotically, to and fro, to and fro. Hawken, Merriman said. The word was very gentle, even loving, but it was a command. The man in green, without a word, knelt down at his left side and stayed there, very still. He said in a beseeching half-whisper, "My lord." But Merriman paid no attention. He laid his hand on Hawken's shoulder and stretched his right hand into the clock. Very carefully he slipped his long fingers back along one side, keeping them as flat as possible to avoid touching the pendulum, and then with a quick flip he pulled out a small black-covered book. Hawken collapsed into a sitting heap with a throaty gasp of such terrified relief that Will stared at him in astonishment, but Merriman was drawing him away. He made Will sit down in the room's one chair, and he put the book into his hands. There was no title on the cover. "This is the oldest book in the world," he said simply, "and when you have read it, it will be destroyed. This is the Book of Gare, written in the old speech. It cannot be understood by any except the old ones, and even if a man or creature might understand any spell of power that it contains, he cannot use their words of power unless he were an old one himself. So there has been no great danger in the fact of its existence these many years. Yet it is not good to keep a thing of this kind past the date of its destiny, for it has always been in danger from the dark, and the endless ingenuity of the dark would still find a way of using it if they had it in their hands. In this room now, therefore, the book will accomplish its final purpose, which is to bestow on you, the last of the old ones, the gift of Gare, and after that it will be destroyed. When you have the knowledge, Will Stanton, there will no longer be any need of storing it, for with you the circle is complete." Will sat very still, watching the shadows move on the strong, stern face above him. Then he gave his head a shake, as if to wake it, and opened the book. He said, "But it's in English." "You said," Merriman laughed. "That is not English, Will. And when we speak to one another, you and I, we do not use English. We use the old speech. We are born with it in our tongues. You think you are speaking English now, because your common sense tells you it is the only language you understand, but if your family were to hear you, they would hear only gibberish. The same with that book." Hawken was back on his feet, though there was no color in his face. Breathing unevenly, he leaned against the wall, and Will looked at him in concern. But Merriman, ignoring him, went on. "The moment you came into your power on your birthday, you could speak as an old one, and did, not knowing that you were doing so. That was how the writer knew you. When you met him on the road, you greeted John Smith in the old speech, and he therefore had to answer you in the same, and risked being marked as an old one himself, even though the craft of a smith is outside allegiance. But ordinary men can speak it too, like Hawken here, and the others in this house who are not of the circle, and the lords of the dark can speak it too, though never without a certain betraying accent of their own." "I remember," Will said slowly. "The writer did seem to have an accent I didn't know. Only, of course, I thought he was speaking English, and that he must just be someone from another part of the country. No wonder he came after me so soon." "As simple as that," Merriman said. He looked at Hawken for the first time and laid a hand on his shoulder, but the small man did not stir. "Listen now, Will. We shall leave you here until you have read the book. It will not be an experience quite like reading an ordinary book. When you have finished, I shall come back. Wherever I may be, I know always when the book is open or when it is closed. Read it now. You are of the old ones, and therefore you have only to read it once, and it is in you for all time. After that, we will make an end." Will said, "Is Hawken all right? He looks ill." Merriman looked down at the small, drooping figure in green, and pain crossed his face. "Too much to ask," he said, incomprehensibly, drawing Hawken upright. "But the book, Will, read it. It has been waiting for you for a long time." He went out, supporting Hawken, back to the music and voices of the next room, and Will was left with the book of Gare.